Uh, my name's Andrew Hiscock. I am really excited to be with you at the Shakespeare Festival in Buenos Aires, and it's a real privilege to be invited to join this discussion. I'm really sad not to be able to discuss with you, but it's really exciting for me to be able to offer this contribution. It's linked to my most recent book, which is called Shakespeare, Violence, and Early Modern Europe. And I teach and I discuss Shakespeare and have done throughout all of my career. And it's a really fascinating subject to be able to share with you today. Well, in one manner or another, Shakespeare has become deeply embedded in our experience of global culture. And the pictures here you may be familiar with of 1623, a number of years after Shakespeare died in 1616, when fellow actors Hemmings and Condor got together and collected what they thought were the complete works of Shakespeare. Well, he's become part and parcel of our life in the 21st century, and for generations. He's been seen to create what I'd call a thinking space in which to understand the ways in which we produce our everyday selves and our everyday lives. So it was perhaps inevitable when I started thinking about Shakespeare, somebody who I'd spent all my career with in textual terms, as well as this ongoing interest and anxiety and perplexity about violence, that I turned, of course, to his writings. And in this case, this project, I turned to the history plays and the world in which he lived in order to explore an ongoing area of concern for me, which is how our experience of life in society and its representation through art continues to exploit violence, to interrogate violence, question violence, to excite our appetites, the appetites of the onlooker, the beholder, the witness, the audience. So I chose 6 of Shakespeare's history plays. Henry VI plays, those 3, which are collaborative plays with other contemporaries in the late 16th century, the 2 Henry IV plays, and Henry V. And I put these in my project against the context, test cases, if you like, of members of Elizabethan England's elite, Sir Walter Raleigh and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, both court favourites, both in different ways, aligned very closely with the monarch herself, Elizabeth I. And I use these lives and I use the texts of Shakespeare's history plays to think about the ways in which the Renaissance anticipated, experienced, and remembered brutality, both on the theatre stages and on the political stages. And all of this for, it seems, the pleasure of readers and audiences and spectators, both back in the 16th century and now in the 21st. Inevitably, in different centuries, in different times, the kinds of violence which occurs in these narratives of Elizabethans and in Shakespeare's play alters enormously. The violence could be physical that's represented, but it could also be linguistic. It could be psychological, or it could be erotic. It could be to do with the law courts and judicial, or it might be religious in nature. And that's just a few examples of the very varied topic of violence. But in each case, whether it's in the 16th century or now in the 21st, I think we find ourselves compelled to reflect upon the function and the status of aggression, trauma, control in our lives in terms of the uncomfortable possibility that there may be forms of power assertion, complicity, pleasure, and indeed commonplace experience in our everyday lives. And very central to my project is that our horror, or our supposed horror of violence, may be a fiction. But let's turn now to Shakespeare's theatres and Shakespeare's playhouses to think about how violence may have been experienced in those arenas. Without the city, there are some theatres where English actors represent almost everyday tragedies and comedies to very numerous audiences. These are concluded with excellent music, variety of dances, and the excessive applause of those that are present. There is still another place, built in the form of a theatre, which serves for the baiting of bulls and bears. They are fastened behind and then worried by great English bulldogs. To this entertainment, there often follows that of whipping a blinded bear, which is performed by 5 or 6 men standing circularly with whips, which they exercise upon him without any mercy, as he cannot escape from them because of his chain. He defends himself with all his force and skill, throwing down all who come within his reach and are not active enough to get out of it, and tearing the whips out of their hands and breaking them. Well, a German lawyer, Paul Hentzner, accompanied his student, his tutee, a young nobleman from Silesia, on a 3-year European tour at the end of the 16th century. And this tour began in 1597. The travellers arrived in Elizabethan England in the autumn of 1598, and this Paul Hentzner took his usual meticulous notes on the customs of each country, here Elizabethan England, and here notably describing how the creative industries, those of the theatre, catered to London audiences. Well, appetites for spectacles of blood, letting were easily accommodated in the playhouse, whether on stage or, as you can see, with alternative entertainments. But Elizabethans might also travel to other locations to visit the scaffold. And if they went to the bookshops, there was any number of historical and crime narratives at the booksellers relating grisly tales of murder and crime. And of course, there were the ancient Roman and Greek texts in modern editions widely available in school and university classrooms to tempt the palate if scenes of butchery and blood were sought. If we look to Shakespeare's plays themselves, when facing his impending doom on the battlefields of France, in Henry VI, Part 1, the great warrior Talbot had originally sent, he said, for his son to tutor him, quote, in stratagems of war. And for those similarly inclined, tempted to travel for more first-hand experience of hostilities, there was a constantly changing itinerary, list of locations that might be proposed across the whole of early modern Europe, where violent contests and wars were unfolding the very length and breadth of the continent. Well, violence, and indeed the theatre of war, remained a frequent resource of government in the 16th and 17th centuries. The historian Frank Tallet has declared that this was a remarkably bellicose age. Between 1480 and 1700, England was involved in 29 wars, France in 34, Spain in 36. In terms of its belligerency, the 17th century was outstripped only by the 20th. And of course, we might think that the 21st century is doing its own energy, devoting its own energies to this profile as well. The consuming interest of Shakespeare's history play and the history plays of his contemporaries, and of figures that I described, such as Walter Raleigh and Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was that this kingdom of England renew itself by expanding its borders, a very familiar concept to us in the 21st century. If another historian, Julius R. Ruff, has argued that violence was part of the discourse of early modern interpersonal relations, when we turn to our own age of the 20th and 21st century, it was perhaps inevitable that this field of inquiry, this investigation into violence, particularly in the aftermath of 2 world wars, that it would come to dominate many areas of cultural debate in the second half of the 20th century as greater and greater evidence of acts of inhumanity was uncovered. The need to engage and to re-engage in such analysis, I think, of violence remains pressing because of the very commonplace status which violence continues to claim on our everyday lives and our understanding of the world around us. This is all the more urgent as a theorist, Véronique Legoisier stresses it, because if in the past the perpetrator of violence has been the other, in more recent times, we've had to reconcile ourselves to the fact that the perpetrator of violence could be an ordinary person, could be ourselves. And to add to this debate, which I think engages so tightly with Shakespeare's plays, is the comment of a sociologist, Mike Preston, when he submits, rather wryly, to suggest that there is any connection between those who perpetrate violence and ourselves is, of course, unthinkable, but it may be true. And so if critical debate continues to emphasize that violence need not necessarily manifest itself, describe itself solely in physical terms, I think amongst the critics, Robert Paul Wolff is a representative voice in broadly defining the phenomenon as the illegitimate or unauthorized use of force to effect decisions against the will or desire of others. Well, this focus upon compelling, forcing trauma upon resisting subjects has been further developed in contemporary cultural debate regarding human relationships which frame the performance of violence, the reception of the act. Thus, in addition to aggressor and victim, we've got now to think about the implications of the roles of witness and of judge. And of course, all of these ideas, all of these inquiries are enormously apparent in Shakespearean performance, where all too often audiences on and off stage are forced to reflect upon their own implication, their own ethical integrity, nay, their complicity in bearing witness to unfolding cycles of horror. If we turn to the tragedies, for example, anticipating the tortures about to be enacted, Cornwall advises Edmund in King Lear, "Leave Gloucester to my displeasure. Edmund, keep you our sister company. The revenges we are bound to take upon your traitorous father are not fit for your beholding." And if we remain in the 16th century and turn to the very prolific contemporary of Shakespeare's, the early modern author Anthony Munday, he argued in his descriptions and his condemnations of the theatre of the evils which he saw as committed on the stage. He declares that the evils enacted pollute the doers, do not pollute the doers only, but that theatre audiences say naught, but gladly look on. They all by sight and assent be actors, so that we are all drawn into this theatre, into this implication of the enactment of violence. Well, the construction between what I am and between what I am not, between self and other, through the enactment, the narration, the remembering of violence, remains as timely, as opposite to the analysis of Shakespeare's age as it does to our own. In the Elizabethan period, we find examples everywhere in surviving documents, state correspondence, legal records, ballads, print culture, street entertainments, rumours. All of these and many more might and frequently did respond to the 16th and 17th century's interest in brutality. However, Shakespeare's plays, for me, force us to take account of the complexity, the fragility, the reversibility of the relationships of persecutor, persecuted, and witness. If we turn to our own age, in the post-war period, the celebrated theorist Hannah Arendt contended that if violence can destroy power, it is utterly incapable of creating it. And in such ways, with such contributions here from Hannah Arendt, critical debate continues to urge us to interrogate, to pose questions on whether the practice of violence can be considered an interruption. Is it something which is provisional? Is it a form of deviance? Is it an ethical failure? Or is it a commonplace experience? After Hannah Arendt, subsequent generations of thinkers in the modern period have often remained less sanguine, less optimistic in their analyses of violence. They've explored the ways in which contemporary society has tried to comfort itself by asserting that we're in some way evolving, that violence has a diminishing grip, purchase on our society, on our daily lives, on our civilizing world. And yet other voices have asked us to think about the functionality, the usefulness of violence, and the way in which it assumes importance and significance in our collective experience of society. And we can turn back to Shakespeare's plays, to plays such as Henry V, to think about how these inquiries are explored. We may remember when there is some querying of whether there are not certain protocols linked to the battlefield, Shakespeare's Fluellen, here in where I'm speaking to you from today, in Wales, associated with his native Wales, Shakespeare's Fluellen submits, is it not lawful, and please your majesty, to tell how many is killed? 4 centuries later in our own age, this critical debate unfolds in lots of different ways. The French political theorist Xavier Chrétier's trains our attention upon the grim possibility that violence yields benefit to those who engage in it. And taking up a specifically intellectual challenge in the literary studies, in an appreciation of Shakespeare and his age, the literary critic Cynthia Marshall argued forcefully that we need a way to account for an audience's pleasure in projected suffering, such as that portrayed in violent Renaissance literature. A focus on pleasure is far from denial of literature's seriousness. Providing pleasure may well be the most subversive of tactics. Well, Cynthia Marshall's emphasis here is very timely, I think, upon the role of the witness, or indeed ourselves as audience members, in the enactment of violence. And it remains key to my own personal project and connects with a much broader emphasis to the extent to which we are horrified or enthralled by traumatic experience reproduced in the theatre. Indeed, another contemporary voice from Europe, here in the Netherlands, the cultural theorist Willem Schinkel, makes the uncomfortable point that the love of violence may be a love of fictional violence. It is also a love of violence. Nonetheless, Such concerns lead on to questions which have haunted human society much further than 400 years back in Shakespeare's time. If we turn to the ancient world in the wake of Julius Caesar's death and the flight of the conspirators into Asia, Cicero wrote in 44 BC to Cassius Longinus, one of the prime instigators of the conspiracy, what can be done against violence except by violence? And of course, this is a question which Shakespeare himself explored in great detail in his own play devoted to that subject of the murder of Julius Caesar. And this thorny dilemma, this thorny question continues very much now in 2022 to weigh heavily upon more recent exchanges and reflections upon this question. I want also to turn to the question of language in this debate. There's a central role for language in the ways in which we construct ideas about our own sense of belonging and those who don't belong. And it's been recognized in the ancient world since the Athenian state was in being that there were those who could not decipher, who could not understand the ancient Greek language, barbaros, and those who seemed to communicate with empty mouthings, bar, and therefore we get the use of the word barbaric. Its initial, earliest recorded usage in the 16th century in Shakespeare's age. Well, amongst Shakespeare's contemporaries, Walter Raleigh is not unrepresentative in this period in rehearsing expectations of what barbaric was. When he wanted to establish a profile, a character study of the barbarian, what does he return to? He returns to ideas of military violence, linguistic ineloquence, an inability to express oneself, to nomadic living, to political anarchy, and to, if you like, participation in the dark or occult arts. In Raleigh's own History of the World, published in 1614, so very much within Shakespeare's career, and indeed in the plays that we find in the playhouses of the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, we're asked to think again and again, not only about violence as an action, but violence as something which is said, which precedes physical trauma. If we turn to Richard II, Ormel argues, let's fight with gentle words till time lend friends, and friends with helpful swords. Well, Shakespearean scholars have often devoted much time and energy to detailing the transformative role which language itself can assume in shaping our appreciation of stage stories, stage narratives, and the enactment of violence. But in our own troubled contemporary age, the theorist Slavoj Žižek has queried in a more general exploration of this subject, what if humans, however, exceed animals in their capacity for violence, precisely because they speak? In Shakespeare's plays, on Shakespeare's stage, we could turn, of course, to the story and the intrigue of Richard III. As it unfolds, the seasoned killer and player, Richard of Gloucester, coaches the Duke of Buckingham in the arts of murder and concealment. Come, cousin, canst thou quake and change thy colour, murder thy breath in the middle of a word? It is this troubling creativity of violence which has come to dominate cultural debate in the modern period. Schinkel, who I mentioned a little while ago, Wilhelm Schinkel, has declared in his own consideration of the productive, the reproductive dimensions to violence, he declares that the destructiveness of violence is only one aspect of the phenomenon. So focusing exclusively on this aspect of destructiveness ignores the aspect of productivity of all violence. And this idea that there might be a positive dimension, that there may be a generative disorder, may be highly localized, might be linked to certain actions, certain locations, but it also might be more commonplace that we have incorporated, absorbed violent actions, violent witness into our everyday selves, our everyday lives, our expectations of our daily experience, responding to threats of crime, antagonism, which may occur in all kinds of different ways, as I've already suggested. This violence could be defensive, instrumental, physical, psychological, judicial. It could be predatory, and perhaps in the cinema, in the theatre, as I've been suggesting, it might even be pleasurable. If we turn to Richard II in Shakespeare's play, Mowbray at the beginning of that play eagerly anticipates the prospect of violence, the prospect of armed combat with Bolingbroke. He declares, "My dancing soul doth celebrate this feast of battle with mine adversary." He indicates his jubilation, his excitement, some which seems to be widely documented in the surviving documents of the time from the 16th century, the ways in which early minds might greet the onset of hostilities. Well, if we listen to some of those early modern minds, we've been listening to Shakespeare, but we could turn to the universities, to an Italian emigre, a Protestant, Alberico Gentili, who was a lawyer, was a jurist, and a professor at Oxford, and he dedicated his text concerning the laws around war making and warfare to the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux. And in that, it's written in Latin, but translated here, he declares, "Some men differ very little from the brutes. They have the human form, but in reality they are beasts, and should be reckoned in the number of beasts." And perhaps one of the most striking, I would suggest, aspects of this theorizing of violence in both the 16th century and in our own period is not only the preoccupation that it's a mode of control, but also that it tries to diminish us as human beings. The famous gender critic Judith Butler has posited the idea that there might be ungrievable lives. She declares, "Those we kill are not quite human and not quite alive," which means that we do not feel the same horror and outrage over the loss of the lives as we do over the loss of those lives that bear national or religious similarity to our own. But I think in the post-war period, it was the French philosopher Simone Weil, who developed this line of thinking to its most dire conclusion, stressing that force is that which makes a thing of whoever submits to it. Exercised to the extreme, it makes the human being a thing, quite literally. That is, a dead thing. Well, all of these ideas, it strikes me, are very familiar to the 16th century, to the 16th century audiences, and of course to the playwrights, to which your festival is dedicated. Any consideration of cultural debate in early modern England cannot be exhaustive, and I've just been concentrating on one aspect of it. Again and again in Shakespeare's history plays and in the tragedies for existence, we find the careers of aspiring warlords being depicted, and, if you like, connecting with experience beyond the walls of the theatre in the 16th century. And Shakespeare uses those narratives of the history play to probe, to question the functions of violence in the operations of society. He's asking us, I want to say, to reflect upon the nature of the ways in which we construct our lives and in which we construct victims and enemies in one way or another. To end then in this presentation, I want to turn to another, I think, very important philosopher who continues to speak to us in the modern age, that of Emmanuel Levinas. His declaration that for an ethical sensibility, confirming itself in the inhumanity of our time against this inhumanity, the justification of the neighbour's pain is certainly the source of all immorality. How can we justify that neighbour's pain seems to me an ongoing and extremely energetic, dynamic inquiry in Shakespeare's plays. The research project that I've been describing to you and is linked to my most recent book focuses then upon Shakespeare's texts and upon Shakespeare's world and the ways in which this age is deeply engaged with an urgent questioning of human responsibility in times of conflict and slaughter. And I passionately believe that those inquiries are as pressing and as timely now as they were 400 years ago. If we listen just to the voice of a Norfolk contemporary of Shakespeare living in east of England and writing back from London, the capital, to his father in the year of the Spanish Armada, 1588, he wrote, "There is diverse speeches in the town. Some speak of war, some of peace, but most of the first." Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you found, like me, that these questions engage with very heavy inquiries that are bearing down on our own minds at the moment. Thank you.
Getting into Shakespeare, the staging of the violence, right? Because, well, maybe first we can go to something more like global, but there's like two big areas of violence on stage. It's like the sword and the word, as you mentioned, right? It's like let's fight with gentle words. So let's go first with the words. The way Shylock is treated, right?
Okay.
And the way Richard III is treated as well. Talking about what Gentili says, that some men are beasts, and this like the humanization of the person.
Absolutely.
It's something that I connect with these two characters. Maybe Othello as well, being mocked for the first in the first scenes until suddenly Venice needs him, right? Yeah. And then, well, we need this mercenary to help us. Same with Shylock, right? It's like the Jew is an animal. It's not even human until needs some money. And this humanization also occurred in the World War II, right? It's like Jews being treated as animals, and it's happening today in a way. It's like how do you find this? Because Shakespeare wrote this plays 400 years ago.
Yes.
And we're still going around this topic.
Absolutely. And I think really at the heart of what you've been describing there, Patricio, as you can, I think you're absolutely right, whether we turn to comedies or to satires or whether the tragedies or the histories, he uses different means of exploring a number of different questions. And the one that I'm obviously concentrating on in this particular project is that of violence. What it strikes me is that Shakespeare initially, in so many plays, you mentioned that the Merchant of Venice, we can think about it in Henry V, we've got the French and the English. In the Merchant of Venice, we've got the Jews and then the Europeans, or we could think about the city of Venice and then the Belmont, this city on the hill, if you like, this palazzo, on the hill. And Shakespeare, I think, initially tries to sort of reassure his audience to think, all right, we have a clear moral distinction. We have got a sense of the French are the enemy in Henry V, and the English are on our side. Perhaps that's certainly the one way in which we could interpret initially what's going on in Henry V, or we could think of, oh, the Europeans are civilized in the Merchant of Venice, and the Jews are, satisfying some kind of appetite that we might feel for an enemy or an other of one kind or another. And this goes on, I think, in all kinds of ways. Troilus and Cressida, of course, is another example of that. We expect the Trojans to be like this and the Greeks to be like that. And what's really excited me and continues to excite me about Shakespeare is that word which I mentioned in the presentation, is this of reversibility. The way in which Shakespeare unmasks our appetite for, perhaps our longing for others, for enemies, for antagonists, because we need these to define ourselves. In order to understand ourselves, we need to in some way identify something which is opposite to us. And then it starts to break down, just as the Trojans and the Greeks begin to seem increasingly similar, in the same way as the French and the English seem to converge in Henry V, having similar sentiments, similar faults. Again and again, Shakespeare, and even I personally, I would think that this happens again and again on a gendered level, that initially we might think in some of the comedies that women think or express certain codes and men are asked to express certain codes, and then Shakespeare gives us a cross-dressed woman or a cross-dressed man, whichever dimension you want to look at it, who seems to straddle both the sexes, and then he begins to show uncomfortable similarities, the ways in which we are become complicit, we become drawn in, implicated into a world that we'd rather not be implicated in. We want to describe ourselves as in some way morally legitimate, in a safe, more reassuring world. But in each of these different genres, in each of these different plays, Shakespeare takes us into a world in some ways we'd rather not rub shoulders with these characters. And yet we're excited by Macbeth, we're excited by Richard III, but these are killers. Macbeth is a reluctant killer, Richard III is not a reluctant killer, but nonetheless, they both have a charisma, and we're drawn in spite of ourselves into their company. So it's really that at the root of my project, is this sense of engagement, disengagement, that movement that we find again and again in Shakespeare's theatre, which is so hypnotizing, so seductive.
And also these executions, public executions, also with James, right? The gunpowder plot, maybe the most famous. I mean, the theater it's a fiction at the end of the day. The actors had this jig, everybody was, entertained and went back home. The other ones, the witch hunting, the executions, well, those were the real things. How do you think different, but similar at the same time? I mean, Titus Andronicus, we have there quite an execution with the two kids. So it's like, I'm intrigued in that, and how audiences, I mean, were they, as you mentioned, have this pleasure for violence, this love for violence, the bears, this entertainment with bears, with dogs, with
yeah, I think there's something it's a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I think there's something very specific. Obviously there are lots of very specific things about Shakespeare's theatre. I mean, one, that we've got an all-male company in a way that we wouldn't have in France, and we wouldn't have in Spain, and we wouldn't have in Italy. I mean, that's a great specificity. Another, it seems to me, a specificity, whereas, for instance, in classical French theatre or in ancient Greeks, if we look at Oedipus at Colonus, it was possible for the ancient Greeks and the French to envisage tragedy without anybody dying. But it doesn't appear that the London audiences, the English playwrights, when they think of tragedy, it seems that the audiences are looking for bodies. They want bodies on the stage, and the corpses, there's a body count going on. And I think that seems to be, to me, something which is very specific, although, of course, with things like violence, the murder of Duncan and so on are sometimes happening off stage, whereas in Titus Andronicus, there's much showcasing, isn't there, of the way in which human life has to be sacrificed and dismembered and maimed in different ways. I wonder just to what extent, I mean, you've got paying, you could buy your seat at the scaffold to watch an execution. You can buy your seat in the theatre to watch Macbeth or Titus Andronicus. But I think the human mind operates in all kinds of interesting and unexpected ways. And what is reality and what isn't reality in terms of suffering, whether Macbeth's suffering or Lavinia's suffering in Titus Andronicus is less meaningful than the screaming person on the scaffold to an Elizabethan audience. Remember, we're in an age in which there is no health service, in which suffering is a much more common experience, and that although war wouldn't have been a common experience necessarily in Elizabethan England, veterans returning from wars would have been a common experience, and Shakespeare's very interested in that veteran like Coriolanus, or indeed some of the characters in Henry V who describe about going back to Britain and taking their war experience with them. So I wonder just what the distinction was. We could have the jig, we could close off the theatre and perhaps, as you say, exit from the theatre and then go home to our houses. But whether are we less haunted by Titus Andronicus and the horrors that are described there than we might be by the staging, if you like? I mean, remember, under Elizabeth, it's been estimated that 300 people, perhaps around that number, are burnt at the stake. So there is a sense in which, as I mentioned before, there's something commonplace about violence. And I wonder whether the experience of crime, the experience of corruption, the experience of warfare has not a similar kind of pressure on our lives as it did in the 16th century, you know, remaining historically sensitive, remaining very aware that we're, you know, of the differences that exist between the 400 years that separate us.
While you were working with the history plays, did you find that violence is kind of like intrinsic in power? You know, it's like you need, as long as you need to fight for power and then stay there, you become paranoid. But violence is the tool you have in a way.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, where this, you know, an example where this really jumps out to us are in those early collaborative plays, Henry VI. And there we've got a culture in which the state has not got a monopoly of violence. It's not the law courts, it's not the executioners, it's a complete free-for-all. We've got such a failing state that the country is torn apart by warlords, by different factions. And I mentioned earlier on, you know, this sense in which this society is so stunted that the only way in which we find human interaction operational is either through curses and abuse and insults in language, or it's through killing. And it's the creativity of curses, the creativity of insults, or the creativity of killing. And what it strikes me as well in those early Henry VI plays dating from the early 1590s is the way in which Shakespeare refuses to suggest that there is a gender distinction between that. If we think of the Queen there, Queen Margaret, she is determined to prove that she is as stimulated, as excited, and as creative. Notably, of course, in taunting York, the father, with the killing of his own son, and dancing this handkerchief, this napkin, a blood-stained napkin in front of his head, and saying, you know, would you like this to mop your brow? It's got your son's blood on it. The way in which that seems to have excited her palate, but I think the way in which those plays are written, we're asked to believe that though it excited the imaginations of the audience as well, that we're drawn in to this bloodthirsty world whose only dynamism, only energy seems to be focused on destruction. And that's, I think, part of my stimulus. What's triggered my interest in this project is, what is the relationship between art and violence? Why does art seem frequently to have recourse to violence in order to attract our attention?
Yes, and who is imitating who? Art, violence, or violence art? Because uh, uh, I was wondering, what do you think of this kind of staging of war and violence? We had it in the Second World War, and on the wars that came after that, and now too. And sometimes while we're talking, we say, well, what would the audience in Elizabethan period thought about the bear biting? But we turn on the TV and we see kids dying in Ukraine, and even if you don't want to, and you change the channel, eventually it will appear again and again. I mean, the media is showing to you that, and there's this thin line between well, showing what the atrocity that's going on, just for you to get informed and eventually do something about it, but at the same time of entertainment, entertainment with other people's suffering.
It is. It's deeply, deeply, on all kinds of levels, it's deeply disturbing. And the way, as I mentioned, I draw on that quotation from the critic Judith Butler, the ways in which certain lives, their experience of suffering, their experience of trauma, seems to be more acceptably presented on the media than others. And is it focused on the nationality of the victims? Does it focus on the age or the gender of the victims or whatever? But as we look at conflicts around the globe, they're depicted in radically different ways according to the audience that's being imagined. And this, I think, took me back to Shakespeare. And you mentioned the way you talked about the Second World War. It's clear throughout the 400 years that Shakespeare, who's not by any means, as your festival indicates, is not the preserve, is not in the ownership of English-speaking audiences, is now a global entity. And the way in which different causes have tried to embrace Shakespeare as in some way promoting their values, promoting their ideas. The Second World War is a very obvious example. But if we then go to the plays themselves, the staging of the plays, of course, Shakespeare had his group, or it was part of a company, and all of these companies may have included 12 or 15 actors. And so we cannot have the 100 Years' War between England and France on stage because we've only got 12 or 15 actors. So we have to have symbolic fighting going on. We have sword fighting, as you described, in order to indicate much larger populations that are in some way in antagonism, are combating each other. But what strikes me, and it continues to excite me, is the way in which seems very distinctive of Shakespeare's theatre, the way in which he's very keen to stage audiences, the way in which he likes to have onlookers, he likes to have eavesdroppers, he likes to have witnesses again and again on stage. Sometimes they're versions of ourselves. I mean, in those Henry VI plays, we get people saying, I cannot look but weep to see what's going on before us. And then sometimes we're alienated, as in Titus Andronicus, when the people are avidly, or Coriolanus, for instance, avidly wanting human bodies to be destroyed. It seems that Shakespeare's plays give us versions of ourselves on stage, in these onlookers, in these audiences. And sometimes we're happy to have ourselves represented in these plays. And sometimes we're really desperately uncomfortable with what's going on. And I think for me, what speaks to us so powerfully about Shakespeare is that discomfort, the way in which we're unable to be soothed, unable to be reassured by what he offers us.
In his villains, there's this violence, but also in most of them, not in Iago, but it's like this regret at the same time. There's always a soliloquy in which they we can explore their concerns, yeah, the ghosts appear, and I'm thinking Richard III, and tomorrow think of me, and this feeling of how did I get in here? It's like Macbeth at the same time. It's like how it's like something that
absolutely, and we're attracted, aren't we, to these demonstrations of vulnerability, this human energy, this dynamism. Even if it's a deeply destructive dynamism, it nevertheless is charismatic. It's something which attracts our attention. And yet, in other plays, Shakespeare can estrange us, can create distances. I mean, in something like Henry V or in Coriolanus, there are relatively few opportunities to get inside the heads of Coriolanus or into Henry V, and we have to listen to other people imagining what's compelling Coriolanus to act in this way. Or if we remember in Henry V, the fellow soldiers saying, oh, well, he says that, but the truth of the matter might be that he's ransomed and we're all killed on the battlefield, or that we're all hanged. So there's lots of uneasy, uncomfortable speculation sometimes around these figures. But then I suppose to fit in absolutely with what you were saying, Macbeth is a perfect example of this endlessly sensitive figure in those opening stages of this play, who is nevertheless drawn to a sense of self-fulfillment through violence. He can only really realize, understand fully who he is by assuming that role of murderer. And that's a paradox which is endlessly fascinating, isn't it? We might think that this is absolutely appalling violence, but nevertheless, Shakespeare does attribute a kind of motivation, a reason for why people are acting as they are. And even more so when we go later on into the career, into the tragedies, into King Lear, into Hamlet, or into Macbeth, into the company of these characters, we've got resisting figures who find themselves in a hostile reality, who find them in worlds over which they have no control. And sometimes, very disturbingly, violence is the only way in which they can express their resistance, is their only way in which they can express the ways in which they dislike and want to disengage from that hostile reality. But I mean, as that very famous declaration from Cicero that I mentioned in the discussion, to what extent then do we become complicit? To what extent are we sucked in to a world if the only solution to violence is another form of violence? And we're living in a world in which, I mentioned that word reversibility, in which friends and enemies have got extremely supple and extremely elastic identities. We're living in a world, we can wake up one day and find out that the people we've been told are our antagonists, our enemies last week, are suddenly becoming people who we're now getting into bed with and signing treaties with. So, I mean, I think that disorientation, that ambivalence, that unfinished inquiry that Shakespeare always offers us is something which offers me an open door, really, into the 21st century. This project began when I've not only in teaching, in discussions with students, in discussions with colleagues at conferences, but also I often find myself when I'm visiting, when we were able to travel and so on, that I go to art exhibitions if I'm there a day before a conference or before an event, and I'll visit art exhibitions. And I thought to myself, well, modern art is going through, or any form of art really, is going through a parallel journey to what I'm exploring in Shakespeare. Again and again, I found that I was visiting exhibitions and I was finding that violence was being used as a trigger in order to attract my attention. So that's where I think that project was coming. And then I thought to myself, well, I'd go to the cinema. And I'm really struck by the frequency with which violence, or the implication, the anticipation of violence, is being asked of me as an audience in order to engage with the narrative that's being filmed, that's being produced. And then that combined, I mean, obviously, as somebody living on the British Isles, that combined with the trauma of recent years. I mean, in Britain, of course, we've been living through Brexit. We've been asked to think about enemies. We've been asked to think about what decisions we make, what party we wish to belong to in this kind of enormously earth-shattering decision-making. And of course, that decision-making seems to be part and parcel of the 21st century, whether it's in terms of terrorism or it's in terms of warfare that you've been describing and we're experiencing all in different ways through the media. Patricio, I think there's a sense in which I was also struck when I was reading around the theorizing of violence, the way in which more and more in the 21st century that theorists are suggesting that violence might be eagerly anticipated, but also for certain minds, for certain groups, it's actively sought. It's a way in which violence can confirm my belonging. I belong to a certain group through violence. It affirms a kind of group affiliation, a sense of a mythology of belonging, and the ways in which in a society that may seem very broken and may seem very dysfunctional, violence can be constructed in certain groups, in certain cultures, as a form of interaction when there are so few forms of interaction. So it's a very bleak and very disturbing cultural debate that's unfolding, but I think it's one that's anticipated in Shakespeare's plays, that sense in which we feel as I mentioned, our lack of power, our lack to make a difference, and the way in which characters take refuge in verbal and physical violence just to seek out a form of change, to seek out a form of power assertion that every other opportunity is denied to them. So I suppose that's something that we didn't really consider, and we might want to consider, and as critics have been suggesting, the productivity of violence, but also that our horror of violence is something which may be comforting, but it might not be true.